Some men spend their entire lives searching for something they can't name. Callum Thorne had stopped searching. 3 years ago, he tracked stolen horses now, nothing more, following hoof prints through territory where most men refused to ride alone. The prints led him into a canyon where the walls seemed to swallow sound, where the air tasted different, where something felt deliberately wrong. When the arrow struck the ground inches from his boot, he didn't reach for his rifle. He raised his hand slowly because he'd already seen them, women, dozens of them, surrounding him with weapons drawn and eyes that held something far more dangerous than anger. They held purpose. 3 days ago, Callum had noticed his horses missing from the southern pasture. Not all of them, just 4. Taken with precision that suggested someone who understood animals. The tracks were light, deliberate, leading northwest toward land he'd been warned never to enter. He'd packed supplies for 2 days, told no one where he was going, because there was no one left to tell, and followed the trail with the patience of a man who had nothing waiting for him. Back home, except silence. The canyon narrowed as he rode deeper, the rock faces closing in like a trap slowly. Tightening, his horse grew nervous, ears flicking back, nostrils flaring at scents. Callum couldn't detect. He should have turned back. Every instinct screamed it. But instincts were for men who still cared about living, and Callum had learned to ignore that voice the day he buried his wife and daughter in the same grave. That's when he saw the first sign that he wasn't alone, a piece of fabric, tied to a branch, faded but deliberate, placed exactly where someone riding his path would see it. Not a warning, an invitation, or maybe a promise. The arrow came silently, embedding itself in hard earth with a thud that echoed wrong in the enclosed space. Callum's horse reared, but he held steady, hands rising. Before the animal's front hooves even touched ground again, he didn't speak, didn't move beyond raising his arms. Just waited as they emerged from positions he should have spotted, but somehow missed. Women, at least 20 of them, flowing down from rocks and emerging from shadows with the coordination of hunters who'd done this before. They wore traditional dress, mixed with practical modifications, leather and fabric that allowed movement. Some carried bows, others had blades. One held a rifle that looked older than Callum, but probably still worked perfectly. Their faces held no fear, no hesitation, only cold evaluation. But it was their leader who made Callum's breath catch. She moved through the others like water, finding its path. Every warrior stepping aside without being asked, tall with dark hair, braided tight against her skull, and eyes that seemed to see through skin straight to whatever rotted underneath scars. Marked her arms, her neck, stories written in healed flesh that Callum recognized because he carried similar ones hidden under his shirt. She stopped 10 feet away, studying him with an expression that made Callum feel like a wounded animal being assessed for mercy or execution. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no accent. He expected, perfectly clear and cold as winter water. You follow those horses a long way for a man who rides alone. Callum held her gaze. They're mine. Everything here is ours. She tilted her head slightly, and 2 women moved forward with rope. You'll come with us. If you fight, you die here. If you run, you die tired. If you cooperate, you die tomorrow after we decide how. They bound his wrists with efficiency that spoke of practice, taking his rifle and knife with hands that never trembled. His horse, they led away separately, and Callum watched it go with something close to regret. That animal had been his only companion for months. The walk lasted hours, winding through passages Callum would never find again, even if he somehow escaped. The sun shifted overhead, but remained hidden by canyon walls, making time feel elastic and unreliable. No one spoke. His captors communicated through gestures and glances, a language built by people who'd learned that words carried too far. When they finally emerged into an open area, Callum understood why no one had ever returned from this territory to tell tales. The camp was established with permanent structures, not temporary shelters. Gardens grew in organized rows. Smoke rose from carefully tended fires. Children played under watchful eyes. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a community entirely of women and girls. No men, not one, Callum. Scan the faces of warriors, elders, children running between structures. Female, every single one. The implications crashed through his mind like thunder. This wasn't coincidence. This was choice or consequence or both. They led him to the camp center where a thick wooden post stood planted deep in hard earth, the kind of post that had seen use before, worn smooth by rope and weather. As they tied him to it, arms pulled back at angles that would become painful long before morning. Callum finally understood the most important thing about his situation. These women hadn't captured him on accident. They'd been waiting. That fabric on the branch hadn't been invitation. It had been bait, and he'd followed it exactly as intended, riding alone into their territory because men like him, men with nothing left to lose, were predictable in their recklessness. The leader approached again as the last knot tightened, crouching to meet his eyes at level. Up close, Callum could see more. Scars and something else, pain, old and deep, living behind her expression like a prisoner behind bars. "My name is Kimmy Mela," she said quietly. "You'll stay here tonight at dawn. We decide if you see another sunrise." She stood, then paused. "Those horses you followed, they weren't stolen. They were invited, just like you." She walked away, leaving Callum tied under a sky turning orange with approaching sunset, surrounded by women who moved through their camp with weapons always close and eyes that never fully looked away from him. And as darkness crept in and the temperature dropped and his shoulders began their inevitable ache, Callum realized something that should have terrified him, but instead felt almost like relief for the first time in 3 years. He wasn't alone with his ghosts. He was alone with theirs, and somehow that made all the difference. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand yet, was that Kimmy Mela had lied about one thing. The horses hadn't been invited. Only Callum had, and the reason why would change everything he thought he knew about survival, about loss, and about what it meant to truly be seen by someone who understood exactly what kind of scars never heal. Night brought cold that seeped through Callum's shirt and into bones already aching from rope and position. The camp settled into quiet rhythms around him. Fires banking low, voices fading to murmurs. Children herded into structures with gentle firmness. Guards remained. 3 women rotating watch in shifts that never left him unobserved. They didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge his presence beyond checking bonds every few hours with hands that pulled tight enough to ensure security, but not cruelty. Around midnight, when the camp had gone silent except for distant sounds of animals and wind, Kimmy Mela returned. She carried no weapon visibly, though Callum suspected at least 2 blades hid somewhere on her body. She settled onto the ground, facing him, cross-legged, expression unreadable. In firelight that painted half her face in shadow. "Most men beg," she said, without preamble, or they threaten, or they try bargaining with things they imagine we want. Her eyes held his steadily. "You've done none of those things." Callum shifted slightly, trying to ease pressure on his shoulders. "Without success, would any of it change what happens at dawn? No, then why waste breath on useless words?" Something flickered across her face, too quick to name. She leaned forward slightly, studying him with renewed intensity. "You followed horses in a territory everyone knows means certain end. Why? Be honest." Answers sat heavy in Callum's chest. He considered lying, considered silence, then decided that truth from a man facing execution cost nothing, because I had nothing waiting back home worth protecting. Kimmela's expression didn't change, but her stillness became different, more attentive. "The horses matter that little. The horses matter, but dying here or dying alone in an empty house 6 months from now amounts to the same destination." Callum met her eyes without flinching. "At least this way is quicker." She studied him for a long moment, and Callum saw recognition flash across her features. the look of someone who understood exactly what he meant because she felt that same weight herself. Around them, night pressed close and intimate, creating a bubble where truth felt safer than it should. What emptied your house? Her voice had softened fractionally, barely noticeable, except Callum had spent 3 years listening for any human warmth in voices that mostly offered pity or avoidance. Fire. 3 years back, the words came easier than expected, maybe. Because darkness made confession simpler. My wife, Sarah, my daughter, Emma, they were inside when the kitchen heart sparked wrong. I was in the far pasture, checking fence lines. He breathed slowly, evenly, keeping his voice level through practice. By the time I saw smoke and rode back, the whole structure was burning. I tried going in, but the heat pushed me back. I tried again and again until neighbors arrived and held me down while I watched it collapse. Kimla's face had gone very still, and behind her, Callum noticed. Other women had moved closer, drawn by voices in the quiet. They listened without pretense, without hiding their attention. I pulled bodies from ash the next morning. Callum continued, unable to stop now that he'd started, buried them in the corner of the property where Sarah used to grow flowers, built markers with my hands. Then I lived in that house alone for 6 months before I couldn't anymore, sold most of it, kept the horses because they didn't remind me of what I'd lost, just kept existing because stopping seemed harder than continuing. Silence stretched after his words, thick and heavy. One of the younger women, barely more than a girl, had tears tracking down her face. Even the guards had shifted closer, weapons lowered slightly. Kimla's voice, when she finally spoke, carried weight that hadn't been there before. You understand what it means to lose everything to violence. You couldn't stop. I understand. Callum held her gaze. I also understand that. Loss doesn't give anyone the right to inflict it on others. Those horses were taken, invited or not. I came to retrieve what was mine. If that earns execution, then execute, but don't pretend this is justice. It's just more loss creating more loss. The words hung between them like a challenge. Kimmy Mela stood slowly, her expression unreadable again. Walls rebuilt, but something had shifted. Callum felt it, and how the women watching didn't look away immediately, and how their postures had changed from hostile to something more complex. At dawn, Kimla said, turning away, we decide, but as she walked back toward the main fire, Callum noticed she didn't order the guards to tighten his bonds, didn't reinforce threats, just left him there with women who now watched him differently, their expressions complicated by something he hadn't expected them to offer, understanding and maybe despite everything, the first thread of unwilling respect, which made what happened next feel less like coincidence and more like a test he hadn't known he was taking. The howl started an hour before dawn, distant at first, then closer with the deliberate approach of predators who knew their prey couldn't escape. Callum's head jerked up from the half-sleep exhaustion had granted him, every instinct suddenly sharp and focused. He'd heard those sounds before, knew exactly what they meant. Wolves, a pack, and they were hunting the camp. Exploded into motion. Women grabbed weapons and formed defensive positions with practiced speed, shouting orders in their language while herding children toward the central structures. Fires were built higher, creating walls of light that should deter the animals, should being the critical word that everyone present understood. Callum yanked against his bonds hard enough to feel rope-burned skin. They're circling from the east side. Your fire line has a gap near the supply tent. Kimmy Mela spun toward him, bow already drawn, suspicion wearing with urgency on her face. How do you know? Because that's where your scent trails are weakest and the shadows run deepest. That's where I'd attack if I were them. Callum pulled harder against the post. Feeling would creak slightly. You need to close that gap now, or they'll punch through and get to the children for a heartbeat. Kimya hesitated. Then she barked orders, and 3 warriors sprinted toward the eastern perimeter, taking positions exactly where Callum had indicated. Just in time, gray shapes materialized from darkness, eyes reflecting firelight as At least 8 wolves tested the defenses with the intelligence of animals who'd learned that humans protected the weak predictably. The youngest warrior, the girl Callum had noticed crying earlier, held position near the supply area with a spear that trembled in her grip. She couldn't have been more than 16, fear written clearly across her face despite the brave stance she maintained. When the largest wolf fainted left, then charged right, she stumbled backward, spear dropping as she fell. Callum didn't calculate. He threw his full weight against the post with everything he had, feeling old would crack and shift. The rope holding his wrists dug in until warm blood ran down his forearms, but he kept pulling, kept forcing muscles, screaming as he tried to break bonds that had been tied by people who knew their craft. Takakota, roll left, he roared the warning as the wolf closed distance. And somehow the girl heard him through her panic and obeyed, tumbling sideways just as massive jaws snapped closed where her throat had been. An arrow took the wolf mid-leap. Ashaz shot clean and lethal, but 2 more animals broke through the gap, heading straight for the structure's wear. Children huddled. Callum pulled harder against the post, feeling it crack further, feeling rope slice deeper, not caring about pain because that girl was scrambling backward on the ground, and another wolf had circled behind her. Position. Cut him loose. Kimla's voice cut through chaos like a blade, sharp and absolute. But he'll run, one of the guards protested. Even as she moved toward him with her knife drawn, he would have already shouted for them to attack our weak points if he wanted us destroyed. Kimla drew her boring back, eyes never leaving the advancing wolves. Cut him loose now, the knife sliced through rope, and Callum's arms dropped forward, shoulders exploding with pain from hours of unnatural position. He had maybe 3 seconds before circulation returned enough for control. He used them to grab the fallen spear near his feet and lunge toward Dakota, planting himself between her and the circling wolf with a weapon he could barely grip properly. The animal charged. Callum set the spear butt against the ground and angled the point up, every movement familiar from years of defending livestock against predators that saw ranches as feeding grounds. The wolf impaled itself trying to reach him, weight and momentum driving the point deep. It died with a yelp that sent the rest of the pack scattering backward, reassessing prey that had suddenly become dangerous. Callum stayed standing between Takakota and darkness, spear ready despite hands slick with his own blood, until the wolves finally retreated into the pre-dawn shadows, until Kimia called cease and warriors lowered weapons with the careful relief of people who'd survived but knew how close it had been. Only then did Callum allow himself to drop to one knee, breathing hard, watching blood drip from his wrists onto earth that had already seen too much of it. Around him, women stared with expressions he couldn't quite read, not gratitude exactly, something more complicated. Takakota stood slowly, retrieved her spear, then did something that made the entire camp go silent. She placed her hand on Callum's shoulder, squeezed once with firm acknowledgement, and spoke words he didn't need translated to understand. Thank you. You didn't have to, but you did. Kimi Mela approached as dawn finally broke over the canyon walls, painting everything in shades of gold and red. She extended her hand to help Callum stand, the first time she'd offered him anything resembling assistance. You could have run, she said quietly. You were free, you had weapons, you could have disappeared into darkness while we fought. Callum met her eyes steadily, too exhausted for anything but truth. Where exactly would I run to that matters more than here? Something shifted in Kimla's expression, a wall cracking that might never fully repair itself. She held his gaze for a long moment, then turned to face her warriors, her voice carrying authority that expected obedience without question. He stays untied. We'll discuss what that means after we tend wounds and secure the perimeter. She looked back at Callum with an expression that held weariness, but also acknowledgement. You've earned this much at least. Don't make me regret it. But as she walked away to organize the camp's recovery, Callum noticed how every woman he passed looked at him differently now. Not as a prisoner awaiting execution, as something else entirely, something they hadn't expected to find bound to a post. In their camp, a man who'd chosen protecting them over saving himself, and in doing so, had begun rewriting every assumption they'd built about men like him. Nasha, the healer, cleaned Callum's wrists with hands that moved with practice efficiency. She worked in silence near the morning fire, applying salve that stung briefly before numbing the pain. Around them, the camp resumed normal rhythms, women repairing damage from the wolf attack while keeping careful watch on the outsider who earned temporary reprieve, but not yet. Trust. Callum sat still, watching his blood mix with medicine on cloth Nasha. Used with careful precision, his shoulders ached from hours bound. His hands felt thick and clumsy, but he remained quiet while she worked. When she finished wrapping clean fabric around both wrists, she finally met his eyes with an expression that held curiosity more than hostility. You could have let Takakota face her consequence, Nasha said softly. Most men would have used chaos as opportunity for escape. Most men haven't spent 3 years understanding that running from one place just means arriving somewhere else equally empty. Nasha studied him with the intensity of someone trained to see beyond surfaces, to read injury that lived deeper than skin. She nodded once, almost to herself, then gathered her supplies and left without another word. But Callum noticed how she paused near Kimla, spoke quietly, gestured toward him with movements that suggested recommendation rather than warning. Throughout the morning, Callum remained where Kimla had indicated he could stay, a spot near the eastern edge that offered view of the entire camp, but remained separate from the main activity. Women passed regularly, some glancing his direction with expressions ranging from suspicion to something approaching gratitude. Children peered at him from behind their mothers, fascinated by this strange man who'd appeared in their exclusively female world. When the sun reached its highest point, Ayesha approached with purpose in her stride. She carried rope and a heavy bundle of cut wood, dropping both at Callum's feet without ceremony. The corral fence needs repair from where the wolves tested it. You know how to work with your hands? Callum looked at the materials, then at her face, reading the test clearly. I do. Then prove your keep or prove Kimla wrong for letting you live. Ayesha turned away, then paused. No one watches you now. Eastern Trail leads out of the canyon. We both know you could follow it. I could. Callum stood slowly gathering wood and rope. Won't though? Why not? The answer came easier than it should have, because for the first time in 3 years, I'm somewhere that people needed me to stay alive. That matters more than freedom. Something shifted in Asha's expression, a crack in her hardness that let through brief warmth. She nodded curtly and walked away, but Callum noticed she didn't assign anyone to guard him. The message was clear. He could leave. They wouldn't stop him. But staying meant something different than captivity now. He spent hours repairing the corral fence, using skills learned from years of ranch work. The wood fit together with careful precision. The rope knotted with techniques that would hold against pressure. Other women worked nearby, tending gardens and preparing food, occasionally glancing his direction to assess progress. No one spoke to him directly, but their presence felt less like surveillance and more like gradual acceptance of someone existing in their space. By late afternoon, when he'd finished the repair and begun working on a second section that showed where Takakota approached, she moved with the uncertainty of youth, trying to appear brave, stopping a careful distance away with her hands clasped in front of her body. My mother says I should thank you properly. Her voice carried the slight tremor of someone forcing courage. For saving my life. Callum set down his tools and faced her fully. You don't owe me thanks for doing what any decent person would do. But you weren't any person. You were a prisoner who'd been told he would die at dawn. Takakota stepped closer, and Callum saw her mother watching from across the camp with protective alertness. You could have let me face the wolf, could have used the distraction to escape. Instead, you nearly broke your own wrist trying to reach me. Your life mattered more than my freedom. The words came simply, carrying truth that needed no embellishment. Takakota's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly. She stepped forward suddenly and placed something in Callum's palm, a small carved figure, rough but recognizable as a horse made from wood worn smooth by handling. My father made this before he. She didn't finish, didn't need to. I want you to have it as a reminder that some men can still be worth knowing. She left before Callum could respond, running back toward her mother, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders while watching Callum with an expression that held less hostility than it had. That morning, he looked down at the carved horse in his palm, feeling weight that had nothing to do with wood and everything to do with meaning. When Kimala found him as evening approached, he was still holding it. The council has deliberated, she said without preamble. You've earned the right to stay as long as you prove useful and respectful. She paused, measuring him, but tonight you face one final test, one that will determine whether you truly understand what it means to exist among us without bringing the violence most men carry in their bones. Callum closed his fingers around the carved horse. What test? Kimla's expression remained unreadable. You'll see after dark. Be ready. She walked away, leaving Callum with sunset, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and red, holding a child's carved horse, and wondering what final test awaited that would decide if he truly found something worth staying for. They came. For him, after the moon rose, a dozen women moving through shadows with purpose that made Callum's pulse quicken. Despite his determination to remain calm, Kimala led them, her expression unreadable in firelight that painted faces in shades of copper and darkness. They formed a circle around him where he stood near the corral, close enough that he could smell sage smoke on their clothing and feel the heat of their bodies displacing cool night air. No one spoke. No one explained. They simply watched him with eyes that held questions he couldn't yet understand. Kimala stepped forward, and the others tightened their circle until Callum stood surrounded by women whose proximity felt deliberate. Testing weighted with meaning beyond simple observation. His instinct screamed to step back, to demand space, to assert the boundary most men would defend without thinking. Instead, he forced himself to remain still, to breathe evenly, to let them control the moment without resistance. You've proven you can protect, Kimla said quietly. Now prove you can submit. The word hung in the air like smoke, complex and dangerous. Callum met her eyes, reading the challenge clearly. This wasn't about physical submission. This was about whether he could exist among them without needing to dominate, without requiring control, without letting his presence become threat through proximity and strength. Ayesha moved first, stepping close enough that Callum could feel warmth radiating from her skin. She placed one hand on his shoulder, firm, but not aggressive, measuring muscle and tension beneath her palm. Her eyes never left his face, watching for reaction, for the flash of anger or desire that would prove him like other men they'd known. Callum held perfectly still, letting her touch exist without responding to it, without interpreting it as invitation or insult, just accepting that she needed to test him this way, needed to know if closeness triggered violence or demand. Nasha approached next, placing her hand over his heart, feeling the rapid beat beneath his ribs that he couldn't control, even if he controlled everything else. Her expression softened slightly as she felt his pulse. Recognizing fear being mastered rather than absence of it. He's terrified, she murmured to Kimla, but not of us, of failing. Whatever this is, others moved closer then, hands touching his arms, his back, his face with curiosity that held no seduction, but rather assessment. They were learning him through touch the way they might learn a horse, checking for hidden wounds, for places where pressure created resistance or rage, testing if he would grab, would push, would use superior strength to reclaim control of his own body. Callum closed his eyes, not in avoidance, but in acceptance, letting himself be vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed since Sarah died, letting women he barely knew touch him with hands that mapped scars and tension while he stood undefended and chose trust over self-preservation. Takakota knelt before him, looking up with tears streaming down her face. No man has ever stood like this among us. They all fought. All of them. I'm not fighting, Callum whispered, voice rough with emotion, and he couldn't entirely suppress. I'm surrendering to being seen. The words created stillness, so complete that even breathing seemed loud. Kimla moved closer until she stood directly in front of him, her face inches from his own. She placed both hands on either side of his face, tilting it down, so he met her eyes at close range. Why? The single word carried weight of every loss she'd suffered, every betrayal she'd witnessed, every reason she'd built this refuge of women away from men who'd proven themselves monsters through violence and violation. Because being alone forever is worse than risking being hurt again. Callum held her gaze despite tears burning behind his eyes. Because you've all lost something, and I've lost everything, and maybe broken. People can exist together without breaking each other further. Kimela's hands trembled against his face, the first crack in her armor that Callum had witnessed. Around them, women who'd watched with suspicion now looked at him with something approaching wonder, not because he'd proven strong, because he'd proven capable of weakness without. Shane, what was her name? Kimla asked softly. Your wife Sarah and my daughter was Emma. They died because I wasn't there to save them. My husband was called Nawel, my sons were Kitchi and Aloe. That died because I was there, but couldn't stop the violence. Kimela's voice fractured on the names, and behind her, other women murmured names of their own dead with voices that carried 3 years of grief. They began to kneel one by one until Callum stood at the center of a circle of kneeling women who looked up at him, not with worship, but with recognition. He was their grief reflected back in male form. He was proof that loss didn't belong exclusively to their gender. When Kimela finally released his face and stepped back, her expression had transformed completely. You've passed the test, but you've done something more dangerous than that. Callum's breath caught. What? You've made us remember that before we were warriors, we were human, and humans who've lost everything either hardened into stone or learned to hold tenderness carefully in scarred hands. She glanced around at her women, seeing them differently than before. You've shown us which choice you've made. Now we have to decide if we're brave enough to make it, too. But even as relief flooded through Callum, even as women began to stand and disperse with expressions softer than when they'd arrived, he couldn't shake the feeling that passing this test meant he'd committed to something far more complicated than simple survival days. Became a rhythm Callum hadn't known he'd been craving. He woke with the camp at dawn, worked alongside women who gradually stopped watching his every movement with suspicion, shared meals around fires where conversation flowed in mixtures of their language and his until understanding happened through gesture as much as words. He taught them techniques for preserving meat through the coming season, how to reinforce structures against weather, methods for training horses that relied on patience rather than force. They taught him their ways of reading land, of moving through territory without leaving traces, of understanding wind and sky with attention he'd forgotten men could possess. 3 weeks after the night of testing, Kimela found him near the horse corral where he'd been working with a young mare, skittish from past trauma. He'd spent hours simply existing in her space, letting her approach on her terms, showing that proximity didn't automatically mean pain. The mare had finally allowed him to touch her neck. That morning, trembling but trusting, and the small victory felt more significant than anything he'd accomplished in years. You have a gift with broken things, Kimla observed, leaning against the fence with arms crossed, making them believe healing is possible. Callum stroked the mare's neck with careful gentleness. I understand what it feels like to be convinced you're too damaged for anything good again. Is that why you stay to heal? She moved closer and Mayer didn't shy away despite another person's presence, a testament to how calm Callum kept his energy. Maybe I stayed because leaving would mean going back to being alone with ghosts that don't speak. He met Kimla's eyes here, at least the ghosts are shared. She was quiet for a long moment, watching him work with the horse, her expression carrying weight of someone deciding whether to trust words that lived too painful to speak aloud. Finally, she drew breath and began. For years ago, this canyon held both men and women. We lived as families, raised children together, existed in balance that felt permanent. Her voice remained steady through visible effort. Then settlers came claiming land they said belonged to them through papers we couldn't read and laws we never agreed to follow. When we refused to leave, they returned with more men and weapons. Callum's hand stilled on the mayor's neck. He didn't turn, didn't interrupt, just listened with the complete attention she deserved. They attacked at dawn, burned our structures, my husband. Noel tried to defend our sons. He died with arrows in his back while Kitchy and Aloe ran toward me screaming. Her voice fractured slightly. I reached them. I was holding them both when the bullets came. I felt their bodies jerk, felt their blood soak into my dress, watched light leave their eyes while I knelt in dirt that turned to mud from what spilled out of them. Callum closed his eyes against the image, against the echo of his own memories of bodies, pulled from ash, of the weight of death in arms that should have held life. 70 people lived here before that morning. 19 women survived, no men, no boys over 12. Kimela's hands gripped the fence hard enough that her knuckles widened. We buried everyone in the canyon's far end. Then we made a choice. No more men, no more trusting that violence wouldn't follow them into our home. We would survive alone, raise daughters alone, exist without ever again believing that safety could include male presence. Until I arrived, Callum said quietly, until you arrived and proved that you could stand among us without bringing the violence we'd learned to expect. She turned to face him fully. You're the first man we've allowed to live here in 4 years. The first one who didn't immediately try to take to control, to assert dominance through force or threat. That evening, the women gathered around the central fire and sang mourning songs that carried names of the dead into darkness. Callum sat at the circle's edge, listening to loss given voice through melody that needed no translation. When they sang for children taken too soon, his throat tightened with emotion he'd kept locked behind walls built from survival and shame. Nasha noticed. She moved to sit beside him, placing her hand over his with quiet understanding. You're allowed to grieve here, we all do. The permission broke something inside Callum that he'd held rigid for 3 years. Tears came, silently at first, then with shaking that he couldn't control, grief finally finding release among people who understood exactly what it meant to lose everything and still somehow continue breathing. Kimla's voice rose above others, singing a name that must have been her husband's, and Callum added his voice to hers, speaking Sarah and Emmis names into night air for the first time since their burial. Around him, women joined the speaking of names, creating a chorus of loss acknowledged and witnessed. When the songs ended and silence settled heavy with catharsis, Takakota approached Callum with her mother Aisha behind her. The older warrior placed her hand on Callum's shoulder with firmness that carried meaning. You are no longer outsider here, Aisha said, her voice carrying authority of someone whose word held weight. You are brother to us now, family earned through choice rather than blood. But even as warmth flooded through Callum's acceptance, he'd stopped believing he deserved. Hoof-beats echoed from the canyon entrance, distant but approaching, multiple horses moving with purpose, and everything they'd carefully built was about to face its first real test. The camp transformed. Instantly, women grabbed weapons and herded children toward protected areas with practiced efficiency that spoke of preparation for this exact scenario. Kimla issued orders in their language, sharp and clear, while warriors took defensive positions along the canyon's natural choke points. Within moments, the settlement looked empty, except for guards hidden in shadows with arrows nocked and ready. Callum moved toward the perimeter without thinking. Instinct, driving him toward threat rather than away from it. Asha caught his arm, her grip iron strong. You stay hidden if they see you here. They'll know we harbor outsiders. They'll use it as excuse for violence. How many times have they come before? Callum kept his voice low, watching the canyon entrance where dust rose from approaching horses twice. Both times demanding we leave, claiming this land belongs to settlers now. Kima appeared beside them, bout in hand, expression carved from stone. Both times. We've held them off through superior position and their reluctance to die for someone else's claim. But each time they returned with more men and less patience. The riders emerged into view, 7 men armed with rifles and revolvers, led by someone wearing a marshal's badge that caught sunlight with authority meant to intimidate. They stopped 50 feet from the nearest structure, scanning the apparently empty camp with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. We know you're here, the marshal called out. We're looking for a man, Callum Thorne, white tall, likely on foot or horseback. His animals were found abandoned near your territory 3 weeks back. You know anything about that? Silence answered him. The marshal shifted in his saddle, hand resting casually on his weapon. We can do this. Easy or hard? Easy as you tell us what you know, and we ride out peaceful hard. As we search every structure until we find answers. Your choice. Callum felt every muscle in his body tense with decision wearing against itself. He could step out in this confrontation before it escalated, protect these women from violence he'd inadvertently brought to their refuge. Or he could stay hidden, trust them to handle threat they'd faced before, except that sometimes protection meant allowing others to defend what they'd built. Before he could choose, Kimla stepped into view with 3 other warriors flanking her. They moved with confidence that came from knowing terrain and having nothing left to lose. This is our land, Kimla stated flatly. Recognized by treaty, your people signed and broke. No man has entered our canyon in 4 years, if his animals were found nearby. Perhaps he met the same end that awaits anyone who trespasses where they're not welcome. The marshal's eyes narrowed. That sounds like a threat. That sounds like information. Kimla didn't blink, didn't shift her stance. You've gotten your answer, now leave. Before you discover how seriously we take our boundaries. Tension stretched tight as boring, the kind of moment where single wrong word or movement could ignite violence. Nobody present would survive unchanged. Callum saw the marshal calculating odds, weighing pride against potential casualties, recognizing that women defending home territory with superior position weren't prey to be easily taken. Callum made his choice. He stepped from hiding, hands visible and empty, walking toward the confrontation with steady purpose that made both sides react with surprise. Ayesha hissed his name in warning, but he kept moving until he stood beside Camilla, positioning himself deliberately between the marshal and the woman who'd offered him sanctuary. I'm Callum Thorne, he said clearly. I came here tracking horses, got caught in a storm, took shelter, waited it out. The lie came smooth as truth, protecting their secret with story that covered reality. These women showed hospitality when they could have shown hostility. I'm leaving now on my own terms, causing no trouble. He started walking toward the riders, each step taking him away from the only place he'd felt human in 3 years. But before he'd made it halfway, Kimla's voice stopped him cold. No, the single word carried such absolute authority that even the marshal's horse shifted nervously. Kima moved to stand beside Callum, then Ayesha joined them, then Nasha, then Takakota, until every warrior in the camp formed a line. Between him and the men who'd come searching, he stays, Kimla stated, under our protection by our choice. If you have issue with that, you're welcome to try removing him. Her smile held no warmth, only promise of cost, but I guarantee you won't all ride away to try. The marshal studied the line of women, studied Callum's face for signs of coercion and found none, studied the defensive positions he could now see hidden in rocks and shadows. His calculation shifted visibly. Whatever he'd expected to find, it wasn't a man. Protected by warriors willing to die for his right to stay. You're choosing them over your own people, the marshal directed his question at Callum with disgust clear in his tone. Callum met his eyes steadily. I'm choosing family over strangers who show up making demands on land they have no right to claim. The words hung in air thick with implication. The marshal's jaw tightened, but he was smart enough to recognize when odds had shifted against him. He wheeled his horse around with movement sharp as anger. This isn't finished, he called back. We'll return. With more men, they rode away, dust rising behind them, threat trailing in their wake. When hoof beatots finally faded, Aisha turned to Callum with expression mixing fury and something approaching pride. You fool. You could have left safely. I could have. Callum agreed, but then I wouldn't be family anymore. And in that moment, with women surrounding him who'd risked themselves to defend his right to stay, Callum understood he hadn't just found refuge. He'd found home. 3 months passed. Without the marshal's return, though everyone knew the threat lingered like storm clouds on distant horizons, Callum stopped wondering when they'd come back and started focusing on what he could build in whatever time remained. Worked alongside the women with hands that had forgotten what purpose felt like until now, repairing structures and teaching skills while learning their ways of reading land and sky with attention that made survival feel less like burden and more like art. But it was the small moments that revealed how completely he'd been woven into the fabric of their community. Takakota sought him out each evening to practice the horse training techniques he'd taught her, her confidence growing with each animal that learned to trust her gentle approach. She looked at him the way she might have looked at a father, with admiration uncomplicated by fear or disappointment. Nasha brought him tea, made from herbs she gathered, always appearing when his shoulders tensed from old injuries or his expression went distant with memories. She saw him as healer recognizes healer, someone who understood that some wounds required time and patience more than any medicine could provide. Her quiet presence had become comfort he relied on without realizing how much he needed it. Ayesha trained with him in combat techniques, testing his skills while teaching him their methods of fighting that prioritized efficiency over brute strength. She'd stopped viewing him as potential threat and started seeing him as warrior worthy of respect, calling him brother with pride that made the word mean everything. When they sparred, she held nothing back, and the trust implicit in that openness meant more than gentleness ever could. The other women had each found their own relationship with him. Some valued his strength for heavy labor. Others appreciated his patience with children who'd never known male presence without violence attached. Some simply enjoyed his quiet company during evening fires. The way he listened more than he spoke, the way his presence had become familiar rather than foreign. But it was Kimmy, Mela, whose regard mattered most, and whose regard had shifted in ways neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. She sought him out at dawn and dusk, times when the camp lay quiet and conversation could happen without audience. They spoke of loss and survival, of the weight of leading people who'd suffered more than anyone should bear, of the exhaustion that came from remaining strong when all you wanted was permission to crumble. One evening, as sunset painted the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, Kimla found him working on the corral fence where the mare he gentled now stood calm and trusting. She watched him for a long moment before speaking. You could leave now. The trail east would take you back to settled territory. You could reclaim whatever life you left behind. Her voice carried no judgment, only curiosity. Callum set down his tools and turned to face her fully. What life? Empty house. Silent days, existing without purpose or connection. He shook his head slowly. I'd rather face whatever threat that Marshall brings than return to that, even knowing we can't promise safety. That violence might find us again, especially knowing that Callum stepped closer, close enough to see firelight reflected in her eyes, because facing danger alongside people who matter is better than safety that feels like slow burial. Kimla held his gaze with intensity that made breathing difficult. You've changed us. We were surviving. Now we're living again. You reminded us that not all men carry violence in their bones, that some carry grief that's made them gentle instead of hard. You changed. Me, too. Callum's voice roughened with emotion. I came here ready to die. You gave me reason to live. She reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together with deliberateness that spoke of decision made carefully. Around them, women who'd been watching from discreet distances smiled with understanding that needed no words. They'd all seen this building between their leader and the man who'd proven himself worthy through vulnerability rather than force. Then stay, Kimala said simply, not as guest or temporary presence. Stay as one of us, as family, as whatever we become to each other in time. Callum looked around the camp that had transformed from prison to refuge to home. He saw Takakota waving from near the horses, Nasha tending herbs with peaceful focus, Ayesha sharpening weapons while humming songs. He now recognized he saw women who'd been broken by violence learning to trust again, children growing up knowing that male presence didn't automatically mean danger, a community rebuilding itself with stronger foundations than before. He'd won more than their hearts. He'd won his own back from the ashes of a fire that had taken everything. And in doing so, he'd shown them that healing was possible, even for damage that seemed permanent. I'll stay, he said, and felt the words settle into his bones. Like truth he'd been searching for without knowing the shape of what he sought. For as long as you'll have me. Kimla smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and suddenly Callum understood what Sarah would have wanted for him. Not eternal mourning, not isolated existence, but this new purpose, new family, new chance at life built on foundation of loss transformed into wisdom. That night around the fire with women who'd become his family, Callum laughed at a story Takakota told. With animated gestures, the sound felt foreign in his throat, rusty from disuse, but genuine in a way nothing had been for 3 years. And when Kimi Mela's hand found his in the darkness, fingers intertwining with easy familiarity, Callum finally understood what it meant to be home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and connection change everything in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider Super Chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.